Many of us probably have struggled to find parking at UVU and have been late to class. But if you think America needs more parking spaces, you might want to think again. Ever since I read an article published by CNN in May 2023 and learned that there are 2 billion parking spaces in the US, I've become more interested in this topic and have researched it a lot more. Many of us in Utah own cars, and driving is the primary mode of transportation. In this speech, I'm going to show you the seemingly unnoticed negative effects of parking lots in the US. I'll start by sharing an experience of a business owner, and then share some information afterwards about the damage being done by parking lots. So I found this story, which I'm going to share in an article in the July issue of The Atlantic. This is a story about an entrepreneur named Ben who wanted to start a New York-style deli restaurant in Los Angeles. He learned that the city had minimum parking requirements he needed to comply with, which needed to be included in his business proposal. The city required him to have triple the amount of parking spaces as his deli restaurant, which meant he needed to find space for a few dozen parking spots. In a crowded city like LA, he wasn't able to find land that's close by that he could buy for the parking lots. So he decided to go across the street and find a mall garage who had plenty of open spaces, so he decided to rent those. After he submitted his business proposal, though, a local homeowners group sued him for not being the actual owner of the parking spaces because they were saying that the mall still owned the parking spaces. After 2 years of legal battle, he was finally able to prove his ownership of the parking spaces. But by that time, he was already $100,000 in debt, and he had to give up on his dream of opening his restaurant. His dream was crushed because of this arbitrary parking requirement that was imposed on him for his business plan. So, why do cities in the US have unrealistic parking requirements like these? In the 1920s, major cities like Los Angeles and New York had a big issue with parking. There were cars double parked, sometimes triple parked on the streets, and the cities needed a way to solve this problem. So, they introduced minimum parking requirements. But in the 1950s, there were more drivers after the war, and they had to increase these minimum parking requirements to meet the demand. But they started to go higher and higher until it reached unrealistic amounts. For example, according to Dante Ramos, editor of Atlantic magazine, on June 4th, he said that there were cases where for every studio apartment, there were 2 parking spots that were required. And another example is according to Tony Jordan, the co-founder of Parking Reform Network. On an interview with CNN in May 2023, he said that for every helicopter stop, some cities required 5 parking spots per helicopter stop, and helicopter stops don't even need any parking. Minimum parking was also used as a tool to prevent change from happening in the neighborhood. It was much easier for people in the neighborhood to increase the minimum parking requirements, which would also increase rent, and keep the lower income people out of the neighborhood, instead of trying to ban new apartment constructions. Parking requirements were initially created to solve the problem of having too many cars in the city, but building these parking lots that were too large actually worsened the problem. By having big parking lots in between buildings, cities became less walkable, and the need to drive had increased. The red in the map here shows parking spaces in Las Vegas. You can see how much space it's taking up in the city. So, these increased minimum parking requirements meant that developers and entrepreneurs like Ben couldn't afford to build new buildings for their businesses and apartments. The cost of building parking lots were often lumped in with the cost of building apartments, which meant that when the apartment was done, the rent was going to be higher. So these cities, a lot of them weren't seeing affordable housing in the area. Many cities are recognizing this problem and already have or is going to reform their parking requirements. For example, in Seattle, according to researchers at Santa Clara University in a study published in May 2020, in Seattle, developers built 40% less parking spots after the requirements have changed, which meant 18,000 fewer parking spots being built for that year. What does this mean for us in Utah? Well, currently in Utah, there's actually a new parking reform bill that's been put in. By removing the requirement, Utah should be able to see more affordable housing in the area as a result of decreasing the cost of developing new parking spots. Henny Grabar, a staff writer for Slate, wrote in his book published in May 2023, "In the US, more square footage is dedicated to parking each car than housing each person. By reforming parking, we should be able to provide more spaces for people rather than cars." Today, I shared information about the damage being done by parking lots in the US. Over the years, governments increased minimum parking requirements to accommodate drivers, which resulted in less walkable cities, discouraging new businesses and apartments to be built, and contributed to lack of affordable housing. Cities are reforming these requirements, and Utah might be the next one. I hope that we will be able to continue to reform parking requirements and make more cities that are car-friendly and people-friendly. Thank you for listening.